Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar through IIRSM West Midlands branch. Thank you to those that are attending today. Here at IIRSM West Midlands branch, we have a small number of committee members, as do a number of branches throughout the organisation, who often seek to provide obviously an element of their spare time to promote opportunities for members to engage with and learn from others. Whether this is through LinkedIn posts or webinars such as this one taking place today. IIRSM West Midlands aims to promote opportunities where possible for the recording of CPD. This may be through other branches or events taking place through IIRSM, the organisation itself, which often do professional development webinars. For those that are looking to attend any events, please view all events from the aspect that you will take something away from the event. You may think that some of the organised events are looking at subjects not generally relevant to your day-to-day, but be aware that these may be the best to attend, as the subjects will be more relevant than anticipated, and you can often learn from other sectors. Are you a member that looks at the IIRSM website? Because I'm obviously aware that quite a few probably don't. From information or even LinkedIn, which tends to be the preferred platform for the organisation, like it is with others. You may have noted from recent posts that there are 3 new trustees, which are, who with other council members will play a vital role in the governance and oversight of the organisation. Here at IIRSM West Midlands, we would like to welcome the new trustees, which is Anna Keane, John Pars and Jonathan Biney, who will all bring a level of expertise that will contribute towards the future of obviously the organisation. IIRSM have also been promoting a waiving of the fee for upgrading membership throughout September, October, as the organisation has now been in place since 1975. 50 years is a good milestone, I'm sure many will agree, in supporting members within the risk management sector. Many of us probably don't, but please spare some time to visit the IIRSM Resource Hub, as this continues to grow with information for members on a regular basis. Here you can also access recordings from previous professional development webinars that have taken place through the organisation, and obviously much, much more. On the subject of the Resource Hub, I'm going to highlight that from the 1st of October, any webinars through the organisation will only be available to members through the Resource Hub and will no longer be available on the IIRSM YouTube channel like they are currently. At the branch, we are in the process of confirming details for a webinar next month and hope to have details published soon to allow for you to put this in your diary. For more information on this, please keep an eye out on the branch LinkedIn page. For this lunchtime webinar on preventing accidents, incidents in this September, we have Christian Harris. For those who are not aware, Christian is the founder of Slip Safety Services and is extremely active on LinkedIn and other platforms where he often talks on a number of subjects. But obviously, as I do, I know that slips is a main focus of Christian's, as I'm sure he will confirm during the webinar. With all these commitments and events, we're extremely grateful to Christian for sparing the time to deliver the webinar on behalf of the branch. Finally, thank you again to the Networks Manager, Julie, for assisting with this. Please put your questions in the Q&A section and we will hope to endeavour to answer these at the end of the presentation. And I'm sure Christian will do his best to go through these with you as well. Finally, thank you again to Christian for taking the time out of your busy schedule, and we'll look forward to obviously going through the presentation with you. Over to you.
Thanks, Tony, and thank you everybody for joining today. If you're wondering what on earth is Sliptember, basically it's something that I do every September where I try and raise awareness about slip safety. It's a good play on words, Sliptember and September, but also obviously the summertime is a period where in many areas we have fewer slips happening because of the weather being better. So September or Sliptember is a good time to start thinking about the changing weather, the worsening weather, and kind of getting prepared for the sort of more peak period, should we say, of slip accidents, which is over the winter months. So before I get into the content, I just wanted to share my backstory because I find it's useful for you to understand kind of where I'm coming from. So why am I passionate about safety? Hopefully this quick story will explain that. If you cast your mind back to 2012, it was the lead up to the London Olympics. And I live in London now, and I lived in London then. My wife, who was my girlfriend at the time, and I lived together. But this was a time before marriage and kids, and so Sundays used to be relaxing. I can't remember a relaxing Sunday in recent years, but they did used to be relaxing. So we decided we'd go and visit this place called Columbia Road Flower Market in East London, where, as you can see, there are flower and plant stalls. There are vendors selling, all sorts of lovely food. You can go and have a stroll along the canal and have a jolly nice time, basically. So we did that. We had a nice time. We started to head home. We were driving and we popped into Islington to go to Sainsbury's and grab the Sunday Times and a few groceries. We parked up our car and we started walking towards the store. And I was walking pretty much where this chap here in the photo is walking. And then that's the last thing that I remember for several hours. What happened was a car sped around the corner, we think accelerated through a red light, was going too fast, kind of swerved a bit, lost control, mounted the curb and plowed into me. So that was me later on that evening. You can tell it's a few years ago because my hair and my beard are nice and dark, whereas nowadays there's a lot of grey visible. But you can see I have a injury there on my shoulder. I suffered a broken collarbone, a broken wrist, a broken ankle, some neck damage, lots of cuts, grazes, scrapes, etc. So not the best Sunday, it's fair to say, but I always say, obviously, I was unlucky that it happened, but I was very lucky that it wasn't worse. So when something like that happens to you, as I'm sure you've heard other people speak about who've also suffered accidents that weren't their fault and injuries as a result, it gives you quite a keen interest in safety. So that's kind of what got me started on my safety journey. So as Tony says, I'm pretty active in all sorts of areas, particularly around content and social media. So I host a safety roundtable every couple of weeks and a podcast called Safety and Risk Success. I've got a LinkedIn newsletter as well. All of these three things are about broad topics of safety and risk. So they're not about what I do at all. We cover sometimes what I do, but it's much broader. So this morning, for example, I interviewed Jason Anker for my podcast. But my day job, my day-to-day focus is on the field of slip safety, and I'll explain why I took my passion for safety and focused in this area in a minute. I've worked in some very high-profile cases in this arena, and next week, actually next Wednesday, I'm releasing my book, which is called Prevent Slip Accidents with Slipology. And Rosie, who is, I think, the co-president, I think that's the right title for her, she's very kindly given me a nice quote. I gave her an advance copy and she read it and gave me a nice quote, so that will be in the book. My business is called Slip Safety Services. We've won a number of awards. We've got some great partnerships with the likes of AXA Insurance and some blue chip clients. And I do a lot of talks for organizations such as IIRSM. We've helped several thousand sites to reduce their slip risk. And at last count, we reckon we're saving about £10 million of claim costs a year. So that's just a bit about me and some of my background as to why I can speak pretty confidently about this topic. So why slips? Before I got involved in safety, I was a management consultant, and that is a job that's all about data analysis, trends, and understanding what's going on through the realm of information. And so when I got interested in safety, because of my accident, I started looking into safety. And what I found was this big problem called slips, trips, and falls. So this is the RIDDLE data for the last 10 years. And you can see not only is slips, trips, and falls the biggest category, but it's also very flat. So when I started to look into it, I realized that, if I'm going to work in safety, why not work in the area that has the biggest impact, and also an area where there's an opportunity to do some good, because we don't seem to be improving, and we haven't been improving as much as we would want to be. Now, one of the things that's important here is when you start to break down slips, trips, and falls, the vast majority of these incidents are slips. And so for that reason, and a couple of other things which I'll touch on, that's why I focus on slips in particular. So slips have a huge impact. Broken bone every 3 minutes, 6-figure criminal fines, biggest cause of A&E admission, $1.5 billion of claims costs. So there's a big impact in terms of financial cost, human cost, reputational cost, etc. But what I've discovered is you can stop these things from happening. So these are some examples of organizations we've worked with in different sectors and some of the outcomes that they were able to achieve by implementing the principles that I'll be speaking about with you today. So I mentioned slips, trips, and falls. We often bundle these three things together into one category, and it's important to know that they're not the same thing. So if you have a problem with people tripping, then some of the stuff I'm going to speak to you about today is not going to be very helpful to you. Conversely, if you have a problem with people slipping and you start to say, well, look out for trailing cables, that's not going to help you either. So we need to understand that there's a difference between slips, trips, and falls. Here's a bit of data from the insurance industry world, which illustrates the point that I made. 3 sectors here: retail, hospitality and leisure, and manufacturing. And you can see that as a proportion of insurance claims, slips is a order of magnitude larger than trips. So overall, if we look at slips and trips leading to a fall, slips is much larger, but also it's a much more complex issue as well. When it comes to trips, I'll just touch on this quickly. I have a little acronym that I like to use called TRIP. I'm a big fan of acronyms, as you'll hear. And these are the 4 key things that we recommend people focus on to stop trips from happening. You have to remember that trips are caused by a low-level obstruction that either we don't see or we're unable to avoid. And there are 2 types of those obstructions. There are permanent obstructions and there are temporary obstructions. So things like trailing cables is a temporary obstruction, whereas a curb would be a permanent one. So across these 4 areas, we can deal with both of these and solve a trip problem. So the first thing is tidy. So this is all about focusing on housekeeping and removing the temporary obstructions. R is route. So this is about creating defined walkways. The reason for that is if you think of, let's say, a warehouse, if we can make sure that people are only walking on specific designated walkways, then we've only got to worry about trip hazards on those walkways. Whereas if people can walk everywhere, we have a much bigger job. So if we can filter people down, then we can manage that risk better. I is for identify. So this is A, about the awareness here of these principles and what we need to do. But B, more practically, it's about encouraging people to be spotting these hazards and, importantly, doing something about them. And then plan, P, is about good design and maintenance. So a lot of these trip issues, when it comes to the permanent obstructions, can be managed out if you're designing a building well. And even the temporary obstructions can be managed out if you're designing a building well. If you think about where replacing plugs, for example, to avoid the need for cables, things like that. So if we do those 4 things, we should be able to do quite a good job on trips. And these 4 things are pretty simple to understand, straightforward to implement, and readily available. I like to use this slide and say it costs £1 to stop trips. EHOs that I've seen over the years have done this. You get a pound coin and you lay it on its side flat. And basically, if the lip or the obstruction is lower than the width of the coin, then let's just monitor that. And if it's larger, then let's try and address it, and that's a hazard. So you can use a pound coin. The reason a pound coin works well rather than saying it's X measurement is because pound coins are pretty readily available. One of the organisations we work with, NHS Property Services, has actually commissioned and bought several thousand trolley coins, which are the size of a pound coin, and they've branded those up, and then their staff across the country are using those to assess the risk of trip hazards. So trips are pretty simple, but one of the challenges is that by bundling slips, trips, and falls together, people have the false sense that slips, trips, and falls as an overall category is simple. What I'm going to now share with you is that slips are not simple, slips are scientific. There are three big blockers that I see again and again that prevent us from doing a good job on slips and that cause that kind of flatlining. So the first thing is that we have a lack of clarity about what we need to do. So when we take a more scientific approach, it's about measuring what matters and having some key inputs that we measure to help to navigate through and manage our outputs. Secondly, we see a lot of perception issues. So, slips are funny, slips are not very serious, slips are cheap and not expensive. Nobody really gets hurt from a slip. We need to overcome that by getting buy-in from all sorts of stakeholders, both within and without the organisation. And then we have an insufficient focus, partly because of these perception issues and the lack of clarity. So what you tend to find is that people are almost always doing something, but typically pretty superficially. How do we overcome that? We need to give people some quite specific actions that they can take. And I mentioned my book. The book speaks about a methodology which I call slipology, and the idea there is to align slips with science. And it's a 5-step model: assess, amend, advocate, assure, affirm. So the book talks through that whole model in a lot of detail, as well as lots of other stuff. Obviously, I haven't got time to go through the whole book in a brief webinar today, but I'll focus in on these bottom two sections. Assess is all about understanding the risk, and amend is all about taking practical steps to reduce the risk. Running throughout the slipology model is this concept that I call chimes. And these are the 6 reasons that people slip. So when I'm called into an organization and they're suffering with accidents, injuries, and claims, and I present chimes to them, typically they say to me that they didn't realize it was as in-depth as this, and they're only working in maybe 1 or 2 of these areas. Conversely, if I speak to somebody and actually they're doing a pretty good job of managing slips, and we start looking at chimes, they seem to be pretty much always doing a decent job around this whole spectrum. So these are the really practical 6 key factors that would cause somebody to slip. So I'm going to run through those for you. C is for contamination. So any floor that is perfectly clean and perfectly dry is not going to present a slip risk. But as soon as we introduce contamination between the foot and the floor, that is going to make a slip more likely. This could be water, it could be grease, it could be dust, it could be grapes in a supermarket, anything really that could produce a barrier between the foot and the floor. So under contamination, we need to know what contamination we have, how much of it, how long it takes to build up, where it's coming from, how much of it can we withstand, what can we do to mitigate the contamination building up, etc., etc. H is for heel. This is about footwear. And with members of the public, it's quite hard to control footwear. With members of staff, obviously, there are ways to control footwear more, so that's one point. Within footwear, though, there are some misconceptions. Safety shoe doesn't mean slip-resistant shoe, for example. And what could well be a slip-resistant shoe in, let's say, a kitchen may not be a slip-resistant shoe walking on grass or around a swimming pool or somewhere else. I, as individual, these are the human factors. So gender and age play a role. An 80-year-old woman is more likely to slip and more likely to be seriously injured from that slip than a 20-year-old man, statistically. But the key things here are around human behaviors. So if we're doing things like pushing, pulling, twisting, turning, if we're distracted, if we're rushing, all of these things will heighten the chances of a slip. So to what extent can we manage out those activities and therefore drive down the risk? These are some of the things we would think about under individual. M is maintenance, and this splits into three: change of use, wear and tear, and cleaning. And I'll give you some examples of those later on. E is environment. So this is the weather. If we think about Manchester, Madrid, and Mauritius, for example, the weather's going to differ in those three cities that begin with the letter M. Condensation is something we should think about here, but a lot of this is about the built environment. So how are our buildings designed in terms of entrance matting, canopies, lighting, noise, ramps and slopes, steps and stairs, handrails, various other environmental factors. And then finally, S is for surface, which is the floor. So obviously, some floors are more slippery than others, and we'll speak in a minute about how we can quantify that. So these are the 6 key areas. What we first need to do is understand which of these are relevant and controllable and which aren't. And if we're not able to control any of these, then we should put more emphasis on the others. So let's say you work for a cleaning company. You can't control what members of the public are wearing on their feet. So to some extent, heel is less under your control. And you can't really control the floor because it's not your building, you're just cleaning that building. So therefore, we need to put, in that scenario, more emphasis on the other 4 of the chimes. Now, the average building across all sectors performs like this when it comes to chimes, and I'll explain how I know this in a minute. So on average, we're doing pretty well on heel. We have most room for improvement on surface and individual, and contamination, maintenance, environment are kind of somewhere in the middle. So if I were trying to support a client that had this profile, the first thing I'd be doing would be saying to them, right, what can we do to address individual and surface to try and get those up to a kind of equilibrium with the rest of chimes? And then after that, right, what can we now do to drive on our performance and strive for excellence across the board? How do we know those scores? It's because we've got a self-assessment tool which we call the Slip Prevention Scorecard. It's a free to use tool, and it takes about 3 minutes to complete. Basically, you answer a series of questions. It's a bit like an online quiz, and it then gives you a score for each of the chimes. So if you haven't done this test this quiz before, I'd encourage you to give it a go. You can go to scorecard.slipsafety.co.uk and you can do it. If you even want to do it now, I'm going to talk you through a journey of a client on the next slide, and that will give you time to go away and do it, because it's quite illuminating when we start to speak about how to address your slip risk if you actually understand kind of where you are on the spectrum to start with. So feel free to do that if you want to now. So this is an example of a client that attended a talk similar to this and went and took the scorecard, and then kind of where they went from here. This is in the manufacturing world. So these were the scores that they got when they did the scorecard. So they were doing really well on environmental controls and on footwear, pretty well on maintenance, but they had room to improve on contamination, individual, and surface. So when you take the scorecard, you have the opportunity to have a review meeting with myself or one of my team. And in that meeting, we go through your scorecard and just try and clarify some things and give you some hints and tips on, based on your profile, where you can look to improve. This particular client, after that meeting, decided that they wanted to invite us in to kind of do a bit more of an in-depth review of chimes and some slip testing, which I'll speak about in a minute. So we did that. The visit there was used to cross-reference and verify their own self-assessment of chimes, but also look at other things that they perhaps wouldn't know about. And then we put together a report for them. And off the back of that, they implemented various improvements. So they improved their cleaning regime to make it more focused on safety rather than just aesthetics. They incorporated some matting and other contamination control methods. They improved on their training. They changed the way they did some of their activities so that staff were doing fewer of those sort of non-standard walking activities that I mentioned earlier. We supported them with some anti-slip treatments of certain areas that were foreseeably wet, and they put in place a new spec for flooring so that when they replace or extend or go into new buildings, they're getting that spec right from the outset. So I mentioned slip testing. The idea of slipology is to get science into slip safety. And slip testing is, I would say, the bedrock of that, because it helps us to quantify 50% of the equation. So we can quantify the floor, we can look at contamination and cleaning wear and tear as well under maintenance. So in the UK, we use a testing method called the pendulum test. Different countries have other testing methods that they use, but this is what we use here in the UK. It's used by the HC, it's used in the courts and by insurance companies. And what it does, and I'm going to share a video in a moment, is it mimics the physical interaction of a heel striking a floor as you're walking along. The output of this test is called a pendulum test value, which is a number. And one big benefit of this test versus other tests that are used in other countries, for example, is that you can do this test in situ on pretty much any floor, whereas certain other tests around the world are laboratory tests only. So this is a video of the machine in action. What this chap is going to do is he's going to spray the floor with water. He's then going to release the foot of the pendulum, and it's called a pendulum because, as you'll see, it swings. The foot will swing down from right to left, and it will strike the floor. And as it does that, picture somebody walking and how the heel, the back of the heel strikes the floor. And then it swings through, the foot swings through to the left, and it pushes a pointer onto a gauge, which is on the frame of the machine. Don't worry about the number right now, because I'll explain the numbers in a second. But here's the test in action. So hopefully you can see, and it now makes sense how that can measure friction. I'll just show it to you again. So it sprays the floor with water, releases the foot, swings down, strikes the floor, and pushes the pointer onto the gauge. So in the event of a serious slip and HSE investigation, they would send in somebody from Buxton, from the HSL, to come and do this test. We do this testing on behalf of lawyers, both claimant and defendant lawyers, insurers, loss adjusters, etc., architects as well. So why would we want to do this testing? There's two key benefits, really. The first is that it helps you to understand your risk. So I mentioned the output of the test is called a pendulum test value PTV. Excuse me. You can see on the top and the bottom here some sample pendulum test value numbers. And you'll see that it's got the red, amber, green. So there are three categories of slip potential. If you score anything from 0 to 24, you have a high slip potential. 25 to 35 is moderate, and 36 and above is low. So they're the three categories of risk. If you look in the middle of the screen here, you can see some accident risk exposure figures. This was done as a research project by the HSE a number of years ago. So if you score a PTV of 36, you have a 1 in 1 million accident risk exposure. Whereas if you score a PTV of 24, you have a 1 in 20 accident risk exposure. So that's the difference between 5% of people being exposed to a risk or 1 in a million people being exposed to the risk. So the benefit of the testing is we can quantify where we are, we can plot ourselves on this chart, and then if we're down the bottom end and we want to try and improve, we have the opportunity to do that because we've got some data on which we can base our improvements. Second benefit to the test is that it helps you to protect yourself and your organization, particularly in the event of insurance claims. So David Scott on the screen here is a lawyer who defends insurance claims made against hospitality and leisure clients for a living. That's what he does. And he and I were chatting on my podcast, speaking about somebody slipping around a swimming pool. And he said that this person would slip and feel that they were entitled to make a claim. No, he said, no. If you, as the operator of that swimming pool, can prove that you were doing the reasonable and practicable steps to mitigate the risk, and in particular, if you have compliant slip test data, you should expect to defend that claim. So if you've got this data and it's up to date and it's done properly, it can help to protect your organization. I'm going to give you a few tips now, or sort of categories or ways of thinking about this challenge that perhaps are a little bit novel to you, and might sort of shift your thinking slightly, and hopefully will be helpful. So the first thing is that we have to deal with flaws zonally. One of my bugbears is going into large organizations with multiple sites and asking to see their policies and procedures and risk assessments. And what I tend to find is not only are they bundled together as slips, trips, and falls, which I've already explained why that's a problem, but secondly, they're super generic. And the reality is that there are differences in zones within our buildings, which make slips more or less likely. So there are a number of areas in a building that are going to get wet or contaminated, unquestionably will get wet or contaminated. Entrances, washrooms, kitchens, swimming pools, shower tubs, shower trays, bathtubs, loading bays, external walkways, those areas are going to get wet or contaminated. And the expectation is that floors and environments, areas, should be safe in their intended end use. Any floor, any area within those types of location, the intended use of it is to be wet or contaminated because of the type of area it's in, and therefore the 5% of floors that make up that category need to be safe when they're wet. Whereas the 95%, it almost doesn't matter if they're slippery or not because they're not going to get wet other than through cleaning or spillages. And therefore, as long as we clean them well and we control spillages well, we don't need to worry. So shift your thinking about, we have a generic risk assessment policy and procedure into we have a targeted and specific risk assessment policy and procedure for specific areas. Entrance matting is something that people rely upon but sadly is often inadequate. This photograph is of a train station, and you can see it's a wet day. And in spite of the fact that they do have quite big matting there, the floor is getting wet well beyond the matting. So matting exists to remove contamination from the foot before it steps on the floor inside. And in this scenario, the matting simply isn't working. On the right-hand side, you can see a table, and this was data from HSE and the Entrance Flooring Association about the depth of matting that you should have depending on the footfall going through your entrances. So if you look there at the high category, if you've got a peak flow of people of 800 per hour, you should have 8 to 10 meters of matting. Now, if you think about supermarkets, train stations, hospitals, schools, big offices, retail, airports, any number of locations would have a peak traffic flow of 800 people per hour. But just ponder for a second, how often have you seen those buildings have built-in entrance matting of 8 to 10 meters? In my experience, almost never. So if the matting isn't big enough, it's not doing its job, and therefore we can't rely on it. And then we need to think about some of these other factors. So stand inside on a wet day, like I've done there. Is the floor wet beyond the matting? Cleaning. Cleaning is something that we do regularly, probably every day in most cases. But are we doing it properly? And there's a lot of assumptions about cleaning. And this falls into the category of, oh, there are simple solutions for slips. Now, if you take this floor in a shopping centre in Manchester as an example, if you walked in there and you looked at that floor, you would say that was pretty clean, I suspect. It's not until you see that a patch has been cleaned and you realise, oh, actually, that floor isn't very clean. So consistently dirty can look clean, but the difference of slip risk between a floor that is actually clean and a floor that is being cleaned but isn't clean can be massively significant. A couple of analogies here that I like to use. One would be if you go to the gym and you lift weights, you could go to the gym and lift weights, day after day, week after week, month after month. But if you use the wrong form and you don't rest enough between your exercises, you won't actually get any stronger or bigger. Another analogy would be a wedding suit. So I've just celebrated my 10th wedding anniversary. In myself, I don't feel any larger than I did when I got married, but I know if I tried my wedding suit on, it wouldn't fit. And that's not because I've suddenly overnight gone from being a bit slimmer to a bit fatter. It's something that's built up day after day in minute detail, and cleaning is exactly that. So we see that floors are being cleaned, and we seem to think in our minds that means that floors are clean, and the input doesn't necessarily lead to the output. Signage. As it says on the screen, what would you say if I told you the pair of feet at the top of this screen belong to a man who's about to die? This is CCTV footage from a Co-op store in Cornwall, and the man whose feet you can see is called Stanley May. As you can see very, very clearly, there's a yellow sign sitting in a spillage of water on the floor. Mr. May tragically is about to walk down the aisle and slip in that liquid, bang the back of his head, and pass away a couple of days later. So the assumption about signs is that they'll keep us safe, they'll protect us, they'll cover our backs. In this case, the sign was clearly visible. It didn't stop the accident. It didn't stop the severe, fatal, in fact, injury. It didn't stop a civil insurance claim by Mr. May's family, and it didn't stop a criminal fine of £400,000 from Cornwall Council either. And here's what Cornwall Council said: signage alone is not an adequate control. proactive measures must be taken to either prevent floors becoming slippery or precluding public access. There are only 2 times that a wet floor sign should ever be used. One is when you're doing your proactive pre-planned cleaning. So you might have a sign out for half an hour when you're doing that. And the other time is when there's a temporary spillage that's causing a hazard and you're dealing with it, which might take you 5 minutes. If you have a sign out any other time than those, that's a symptom of a problem that you're not addressing correctly. And as the case of Mr. May shows, the sign is not going to protect you, certainly not from a legal perspective. And then here are 3 examples of floors that sort of look safe, in inverted commas, looking safe, versus actually being safe. And this is about specification, it's about wear and tear, it's about cleaning, maintenance, and the chimes. So this surface was chosen because it was textured and it was anti-slip. Well, that was the perception. It's in a hospital and it's used to push trolleys up and down those stairs to deliver food to patients. People were finding it was slippery and they were slipping. We were asked to come in and assess the floor. We tested it and we found that the floor was very, very slippery in spite of looking anti-slip. And it was actually quite a new floor, a new ramped surface that they'd put in. But this floor was never slip resistant or anti-slip to begin with, but it was chosen because it looked like it should be. This example here is one of wear and tear. So when I walked into this spice blending facility, I looked at the floor and I thought, oh, this will be fine. This will get good scores. We did some testing and actually the floor was very, very slippery. Upon further investigation, if you move the racking to the left of this photo, or if you go right close to the walls where nobody's ever walked, the floor is very, very textured. It's as rough as sandpaper and it's very, very slip resistant. That's how the floor was installed and specified, but that was over a decade ago. And now the floor looks like it should be anti-slip. Even I walked in and thought, yeah, this is a good anti-slip floor, because to look at it, you can't tell, but actually it's very, very slippery. And then here's an example of cleaning. So this is from a leisure centre, and the general manager of this leisure centre had the view that we're okay on slip safety because we've got anti-slip tiles. And he was right that they did have anti-slip tiles, but the problem was they were cleaning the tiles ineffectively, and therefore the tiles were slippery. Once the tile was cleaned properly, like you can see in this photograph, it was safe. But in its current form, it wasn't safe. And this is a point around cleaning, maintenance, but also the fact that we need to be thinking about this holistically. There's no such thing as a magic bullet. There's no such thing as, if you put this floor in, you'll be fine. Or if you use this cleaning machine, you'll be fine. Or if you put this sign out, you'll be fine. We need to be looking at this holistically. And when it comes to floors, you can't tell, even I can't tell. And if anyone in the world could tell, then it would probably be me, without being too tooting my own horn too much. I can't tell if a floor's safe or not by just looking at it. So you need to have that up-to-date testing data. So why should you care about this? We did a survey a couple of years ago of several hundred safety and risk professionals, and slips was a relevant risk to 85% of people. So there's a good chance it's a relevant risk to you and your organization. But if you get hold of this and you implement some of the philosophies and the strategies that I've been speaking about, straight away you'll have the benefit of being able to quantify and have some certainty that you've reduced risk. Because this is all about what can we measure and therefore what can we prove. And then in the long run, what we see based on our experience is fewer people getting hurt, more time, if you think about it, fewer accidents to investigate, fewer forms to fill in, fewer claims to deal with, etc. And of course, lower costs for the organization as well. So to recap, and hopefully you've got this from the presentation, slips are serious, they are scientific, but they absolutely are stoppable. Here again are some examples of where we've been able to support clients to achieve significant reductions in accidents, injuries, and claims across different sectors. So a couple of next steps, and then we'll wrap up. If you're on LinkedIn, do come and connect or follow me there. As mentioned, I'm posting a lot about slip safety, but also about safety and risk more broadly. So I'm sure you will get some value from following or connecting on LinkedIn. If you are interested to hear a bit more about the book and delve into this stuff in much more detail, then please do join me on Wednesday the 18th at 12:30, where I'll be launching my book on a live safety roundtable webinar. So it'd be great to see you for that. So coming to the end, summing up, and then happy to take some questions. Hopefully what you didn't get from this is that it's all about slip testing. It's all about chucking away your yellow signs. And then that's all you need to do. If that's what you thought, then you've missed the point. What I'm known for is to try to bring a fresh scientific approach to an age-old, very stubborn problem. So trying to get people to do things a bit differently in this area, and taking a second look, I suppose, at this area of risk. And hopefully after listening to this, you will feel a level of confidence and a level of certainty that it is possible to control this risk. It isn't something that is inevitable. It might be a nagging pain, but actually if you take some subtle but not simple steps to address it scientifically, it is possible to make a big impact. So that's it from me in terms of the slides. Thank you very much for your attention. I've run pretty much on time, which is always a bonus, but I think there is a bit of time for Q&A. So I will stop sharing and happy to take any questions in the chat, or if you want to unmute, if you're able to unmute on this, I'm not sure, but feel free.
Hi, Christian. There is a question in the chat. I don't know if you can see it, but I'll put it over to you if you wish. It says, I understand that most slips happen at the interface between two different floor types with different friction characteristics. Does this match with your experience and data?
Yes, lots and lots of slips happen in that scenario where you've got two different floor types. There's a reason for that, and it's because when you're walking, you're not thinking about walking, and you're not sort of with a high degree of focus looking for hazards. So if you're walking along on a floor and you're walking fine and you've got a degree of friction and you feel safe, then your kind of expectation is, I'll carry on walking and I'm going to be fine like this. So if you are going from one surface to another and the slip resistance characteristics do change significantly, that can lead to a problem, particularly if it's less obvious, shall we say, that the floor is changing. And that's also the reason why when there is a spillage, let's say, and it's on a floor that kind of looks like it should be anti-slip, we're more likely to slip as well, because if you're walking on a highly polished marble floor, you know instinctively that floor is probably going to be a bit slippery. So you're going to be a little bit more guarded about the way you're walking. You're going to be looking a little bit more for hazards. Whereas if you're walking on a floor like in that spice blending factory that looks like it should be safe, you're probably not going to be so fussed. And then if there is a bit of water or dust or spices in this case on the floor, then you're probably going to find yourself slipping. And obviously, I've never slipped and fallen, but I've slipped a lot of times because you can slip and then not fall. So, and that's where near miss reporting is quite hard in this area. But if there's a floor that, again, you perceive as being a bit slippery and you feel like there's a risk, you're going to be probably that slightly bit more able to break your own fall or sort of mitigate the fall and not fall, sorry, by preventing the regaining your balance than if it's a floor you perceive it to be safe and you're just kind of relaxed.
Yeah. I'm going to share in some ways. I hope, well, I'll say you'll probably tell by my skin color at the minute that I'm quite reasonably tanned. I've just come back from a holiday abroad, and I'll share with you exactly in some ways what you've just been talking about. I was down on the beach in the day, obviously taking in the sun rays of over 30 degrees. Came
Yeah,
back from the beach, rinsed my feet stroke footwear underneath the shower stroke the cleaning area that you've got as you're coming back up from there. And literally within probably about 2 or 3 meters, I was going from what you would class as like more of a slab type surface. And I came to some steps that took you down to what they classed as the poolside bar. And literally, as soon as I put my foot down on the top step, it just went straight away. And a person behind me said, "My God," he says, how you managed to stay on your feet, I'll never know."
yeah,
It can catch many people out. Yeah,
yeah,
I'll say quite easily, especially like that question put across that if you're moving from one surface to another and you don't really pay that much attention to the variables.
yeah. No, absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I've obviously written down a few notes from when we were going through the webinar, and I'll say thank you again for obviously all the information that you've shared. If I'm going to quickly refer to Jason Anker because I've had the pleasure of meeting him myself and listened to his story on a number of occasions, and I know he's a fantastic speaker, just like yourself. I've written down here, for instance, that he obviously during his talks he certainly highlights the impact that a fall can have not only on the injured person but also on the extended family. Because I
Mm.
know his daughter also does talks um, uh, across different organisations, so she's
Yeah.
also helping to promote that area as well. Do you feel yourself that the impact of slips should be shared more by companies to, in some ways, try and control risks a little bit better?
Yeah, I fully agree with that. And I mean, the Stanley May case that I mentioned,
Yeah,
he was quite elderly. He was in his 70s. Well, that's not that old, late 70s. You know, people live a lot longer than that. But he sadly passed away from this accident, and actually his wife passed away a matter of weeks after that as well. And you often hear about um, spouses who've been married for decades, and if one of them goes, that the other one goes. So that's another example just from that one particular incident. But I absolutely agree that we need to raise the profile of this. And that's kind of why I do what I do. That's why I'm doing the book, et cetera, et cetera. I think that the um, one of the big challenges here is those perception issues. So, you know, people just don't think that a slip is likely to lead to such a significant injury, but it does. You know, not in the same number as people who are breaking their wrist or their ankle, obviously. But there are a dozen amputations a year. There are a dozen brain injuries a year. There are always fatalities a year from people slipping. So, it can be very, very serious. And I think that, the way that we look to uh, score risk and address risk based on, impact versus frequency, sometimes we misconstrue and we think that this is a bit less impact than it actually could be. So, and that's what the criminal fines show actually. So, uh, I mentioned that Co-op were fined after the Stanley May incident, but Tesco were fined £733,000 after a man slipped and broke his hip. And you don't get fined that much money for an incident where there wasn't the potential for it to be a very, very serious injury.
yeah.
So the courts have kind of seen this, but we haven't quite caught on yet in terms of the way that we're addressing that risk, I would say.
Yeah, yeah, I know what you mean. I mean, it's like I was going to bring up. I must admit I even thought about it in some aspects before seeing all of your slides. That it's something that I've tried to do a little bit more at the company where I am. Is in some aspects use the slip signage, the cone style signage less, just because people are walking in from outside and the surface is wet and they're coming inside. We provide mats as soon as you come in through the door to dry your feet. But like you're alluding to in your presentation, for me, there's no reason really why I should be putting wet floor signage out. Yeah, because people are walking in from where it's throwing it down outside. Yeah, like you're saying, if it was a spillage or if it's a temporary cleaning process or something like that, then yes, I can justify the signage a little bit more. But like you, I feel that sometimes people just tend to put that signage out as if to say, well, I've done my bit. Yeah. You need to try and do your bit. And as if they're trying to take all the onus away from themselves.
Yeah, and it's a difficult one to navigate because obviously, you know, if you put the sign out and it does stop one person from suffering an accident, then obviously there is a benefit there. But the misconception around it is that, you know, the sign protects us and covers us, and as long as we've got the sign out, then it doesn't matter if someone slips because we'll be okay. And that isn't the case. So yeah, it's just understanding what all of these things, you know, in every walk of life, have pros and cons, and you know, advantages and disadvantages, and so it's just understanding, you know, what is actually effective and what isn't effective.
Yeah. If I ask you, if you don't mind, whether you can or can't in some ways help with the question, I suppose, in some aspects. But when Riddle moved from 3 days to 7, for instance, how do you feel that affected, for instance, the slips, trips, falls reporting process? Do you think it's sort of done it an injustice, for want of a better expression, or do you feel that? Because in one aspect, I'm thinking that the HSE might have done it just to try and minimise how much reporting's coming through to them that they've then got to catalogue and deal with.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Nobody's ever asked me that before. What I would say is the percentages I don't think have really changed. So from 3 to 7, it's still the same. You know, it's plus or minus 30% year after year after year after year. So I don't think that from the perspective of, you know, if it had gone from, you know, 50% to 30% just by that change, then maybe there's an argument there to say that's negated. But I think I think it hasn't really changed the challenge that much. I think it's more about, you know, the mindset of taking a RIDDOR maybe more seriously, as in a less serious RIDDOR. But you know, obviously we don't want deaths and amputations and you know, people being paralyzed and all of that sort of stuff. Nobody wants that to be happening. But actually, you know, these are life altering and sometimes life changing injuries, and we shouldn't be wanting these life altering injuries either. You know, paper cuts, you know, okay, let's not go overboard on paper cuts. But these are a bit more serious than I think most people think.
Yeah. Because I'm mindful of time as well, and know that some people may be obviously coming towards the end of their lunchtime or so on. If I ask you just one more question, and in some ways this is, I suppose, a little bit loaded because I'm partly from an insurance or within insurance sector, although albeit that be a little bit remote. Do you think that insurance companies could do a little bit more, because you might tend to find that people think it's an easy win, pardon the expression?
Yeah, I do. I think there's a mindset that insurance companies don't want to defend claims, and that isn't my experience. I know insurance companies want to defend claims, because if you understand how they make their profit, they make their profit by charging you X and your claims being less than X. So every claim is eroding their profit. So they are aligned to wanting to defend claims. The challenge that insurers say to me is that often the organizations that they're insuring simply don't have enough evidence around the defenses that they've put in place and the control measures they've put in place to enable them to be robust about defending. And that's where, again, this kind of more scientific approach, in my experience, in my opinion, is valuable, because, you know, you can do all the steps that I recommend, you can take all the measurements that I recommend, you can actually be legally compliant and in a position to defend yourself, very, very rigorously when it comes to a claim. But somebody might still slip and hurt themselves.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily about that. Of course, we want to have, fewer accidents and injuries and claims coming in to start with, but we also want to be protecting ourselves. But often, it's just a case that actually it's too superficial, it's too high level, it's too generalist. There's not enough detail, there's not enough evidence, and therefore commercially it's a case of, well, we could try and fight this and it might cost us 6 or 7 grand to fight it, or we could pay out the person 5 grand and just write it off.
Yeah. I know. I completely agree. I understand that. Yeah, most definitely. I'll say thank you again, Christian, for obviously sparing the time to deliver this webinar for us. It's really appreciated. We obviously hope that in some aspects we can assist with trying to cut down obviously the amount of slip, trips and falls in the workplace. In some aspects as the same as yourself. So we'll do as much as we can to obviously help promote it, likewise with yourself.
Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you everybody that's attended, and look forward to speaking to you or seeing you at the next webinar. Thank you, Christian.
Cheers.